Hi, my name's Katie Pekarik and I'm an extension educator with the University of Nebraska. Today we're out at Holmes Lake and we're going to talk a little bit about aquatic vegetation, biology, and identification. Although too much aquatic vegetation can be a problem for recreational use, such as sporting activities, boating, and fishing, a little bit of aquatic vegetation is essential for the health of our aquatic environment. Aquatic vegetation has many benefits. It can do things like oxygenate the water, so you have an oxygen source for the fish and wildlife within the pond. It provides food, shelter, cover for numerous aquatic organisms. It can also help to stabilize the shoreline and stabilize the bottom of the pond. Therefore, you're holding that soil in place and minimizing the erosion and lowering the turbidity of the water. Unfortunately, when plant growth becomes excessive, the aquatic vegetation becomes weeds. This occurs primarily when ponds have had additional sediment coming in over the years called sedimentation, and with that sediment it has brought in fertilizers such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which then allow the weeds to grow to an excessive extent. Locations most prone to aquatic weed growth include those that have had sedimentation over the years, where the water levels are shallower and where phosphorus and nitrogen have become excessive within the water. Additionally, anywhere where there is stagnant water allows vegetation to become more established. It's really when the water becomes shallow and you have that penetration of the light from the surface to where the seed has landed, that's where you're getting that growth of the aquatic vegetation. So in a canal, you're going to see it mostly along the banks, whereas in a lake, you're going to see it mostly along the edges when you've got the sedimentation coming in. If you have a pond, even though it's smaller than a lake in most people's minds, if you have a pond, it's most likely to become excessively vegetated along the banks as well. But if you have a very diverse pond, and if you have those appropriate changing depths throughout the pond, you can really minimize the amount of aquatic weeds that you see in a pond. All right, so there's several different problems that can be associated with excessive weed growth. One of the most common problems that we think of is having an interference with our recreational activities. Things like boating become very difficult. Things like fishing become extremely difficult. You also have certain species of aquatic weeds and dying and decomposing weeds that really can contribute to a foul taste or in the water or a foul odor. And you can also have things occurring within the water that create an ugly color to the water. You can actually have tannins released from the aquatic weeds that create a dinge to the color as well. And finally, when you get a lot of excessive weeds, once you have their die-off and decay, they actually end up using the oxygen from the water for their decomposition and for their growth. But what this does is that it takes away oxygen from the water that the fish need to survive. Weed identification is extremely critical to selecting the correct and appropriate action to managing those weeds. So we basically break it down into 5 different categories of aquatic weeds. Those include algae, free-floating vegetation, rooted floating vegetation, submerged vegetation, and emergent vegetation. So this is an arrowhead. This is an example of an emergent weed. So what you have is you have a root that is down in the soil itself. You have a stalk that is coming up through the water, and then you have these arrowheads that are actually sticking out of the water or emerging out of the water. So this is something that we call an emergent plant. So another example of emergent vegetation would be to include cattails. These are something that most people are fairly familiar with and actually end up being the bane of most ponds and lakes. Unfortunately, cattails have gotten a bad reputation. If you have just a few cattails, they actually add to the diversity of the aquatic vegetation. However, when you get cattails growing in excess and you get a lot of shallow depths, you can create a real cattail habitat and the cattails can take over the entire pond or lake. Moving on to our submerged category, one of the most common submerged aquatic weeds is milfoil. Milfoil is rooted into the bottom of the sediment, and the green leaves actually float up into the water column but do not emerge out of the water. So therefore, the entire plant is submerged underwater. One of the most common aquatic floating vegetations that we think about is actually a lily. They have this kind of a picturesque quality to them, but there's lots of other alternative floating and rooted floating weeds within a pond. One of the more common ones is to think of is duckmeal or duckweed. Duckweed is a beautiful bright greenish yellow color, and it kind of comes into something that looks like you've got small round rice grains about the size of a rice grain floating on top of the water. It usually is clumped together and floating together, but when it starts, you might just see a group of 3 little dots right together. So probably the most common rooted floating weed that we do have is the American pondweed. It's got a long stalk that comes out of the water and has a floating weed on top. There are invasive versions of this, such as like the curly pondweed, that can really cause excessive problems. And again, this happens most often when you have shallow areas that have become sedimented in, and the nutrients, phosphorus, and sediment have made the area ripe for pondweed growth. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is algae. This is actually a filamentous algae, and one of the great things about it is that it really sticks, and it's almost like it's grabbing things, so it's able to hold things in place. But you'll even notice here that you've got one of these submerged vegetations, this Eurasian milfoil, stuck within the algae itself. Now, algae is another category of our types of plants that we're talking about today. So we really talk about 3 types of algae. One is filamentous algae, so that's the ones that you think about having the big long strings. The other one would be planktonic algae, so you might think about something like a pea soup algae, so when you get in the water and you can't see through the greenness. And then the third one is actually not a true algae, it's more of a primitive bacteria, but it has the powers of photosynthesizing like algae. And that's what we call blue-green algae or toxic blue-green algae. So the big difference between the aquatic vegetation and the algae is going to be that the algae is not going to need that soil requirement. It's getting its nutrients and its food source from the floating and the available phosphorus and nitrogen that's within the water column. In Nebraska, the main time that you're going to see an algae bloom is in the spring runoff season. So when rainfall events are the greatest and they're actually carrying the water and the nutrients off of the soil surface into the ponds and the lakes, giving the algae a greater food source to grow, is when you're going to see the algae blooms most often occurring in Nebraska. So aquatic weeds are like any other vegetation you might see on the banks or not in a pond situation. They require certain things for them to grow successfully. The first of which is going to be the proper soil temperature conditions. So you have to have the right soil temperature that lets the seeds from these aquatic weeds start growing. You also have to have the proper light conditions. So you have to have sunlight during the day, and you have to have enough of a day length for these to begin growing. And then you also have to have some of the proper water conditions. So in the case of aquatic vegetation, that water has brought in the nutrients or the food source for the plants. And so when it has those 3 things combined, it has a water source and a food source. It has light, so it can complete photosynthesis, and it has the proper growing temperatures. Then the aquatic weeds can grow, and sometimes they grow to an exciting amount, and sometimes they grow in excess. So in managing for aquatic vegetation, they really don't begin growing in Nebraska until June, and sometimes they really don't need to be managed for until mid-June or July. That's because these are when the soil temperatures and the light conditions and the water conditions have become ideal for their growth. Now these plants will continue to grow on through the summer. They'll have a little bit of a lull during the summer and can grow excessively again going straight into the fall. The best benefit we have in Nebraska is that in the winter the aquatic weeds will die back, can be cut back, and they'll actually overwinter and then begin their whole growth cycle again, come again in the spring.